Hey, welcome to Restoration. I'm Matt. Glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you are watching this message. We're glad that you're here with us, and we are this weekend celebrating the festival of Purim. And I'll start with a story that I told last year as well with Mount Rainier. So, Hasidic parable goes like this. A man was standing looking at a beautiful view of a mountain, and another man came and put his hand in the way of the mountain. As he held his hand there, he said, "The hand is so much smaller than the mountain and the valley. However, it can still block them. So it is with us, that the objects of this world are so much smaller than God, yet they can block him from our view. It is our task to see God anyway." So today, for the festival of Purim, I want to share a message with you called See God Anyway. Because through the book of Esther and in the celebration of Purim, we learn about celebrating in the midst of pain. So to see God anyway is a hope. It's a choice. It's something we do even when it does not feel logical. When all goodness is stripped away and we feel like everything's falling apart. The pain becomes so heavy that we feel like death would be better than life. So we try to fill the pain with all kinds of things that can make us numb to the overwhelming suffering in our lives, instead of feeling the pain. We ask, how can we see God anyway this Purim? Especially this Purim, because since October 7th, this has been the reality of life for both Israelis and Palestinians. And it's easy to forget because, well, we're not there. People are not dying around us, and rockets are not being fired into our towns, and soldiers are not breaking down doors and searching neighborhoods. Our friends and our family have not been taken, and they're not being kept by enemies, so we forget. Yet, built into the Jewish calendar are holidays that somehow force us to live in tension. The tension of hatred and violence in the world, and the simple joys of life that happened around us. You know, I say it all the time, the joke for every Jewish holiday, the reason why we celebrate is they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And of course, Purim is one of the clearest pictures of that. And it's funny. And it's also born out of the pain and oppression and hatred of the Jewish people that we have experienced and continue to experience for thousands of years. People often ask me, have been asking me recently, how do you feel with the rise of anti-Semitism? And my answer is usually the same. Well, there are ebbs and flows of hatred for Jewish people, and it's always present. The real question is, how do we celebrate in the midst of pain? How can you celebrate God in the midst of difficulty and suffering? How can you see God and celebrate God when he seems so absent? And the answers to these questions are the heart of the book of Esther in the Bible. And in the time of Esther, all kinds of things are happening in the world. Confucius is teaching in China. It's the golden age of Greece. There are major world battles between the Persians and the Greeks. A few years following Esther are Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And the Peloponnesian Wars happen right after Esther. Athens, the Spartans, the Immortals, a lot of important world events. And the book of Esther is this satirical, violent, sometimes humorous portrait of life outside of Israel. Unlike the books of Daniel and Ezra, Esther imagines life completely away from Jerusalem and the temple and contains no mention of the Torah. In fact, Esther is the only book of the Bible that never mentions God. Never mentions Israel or Jerusalem or the temple, never mentions prayer aside from fasting and mourning. And traditionally, this is why we wear masks at Purim, because God is hidden behind a mask in the whole story of Esther. And Esther's contemporaries, biblical contemporaries, are Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. It's one of the last books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh. It's a post-exilic book because it's after the Babylonian exile, and there's this gap of 60 years that happens in the book of Ezra between chapter 6 and chapter 7. And it's during those 60 years that the events of the book of Esther transpire in Persia. The temple's already rebuilt. The walls around Jerusalem are being put back up. Many Jewish people have returned to Israel in 3 waves, and Ezra and Nehemiah return. But Mordecai and Esther are among those who stay in Persia and do not return to Israel. So Esther becomes this story of Jewish survival in a foreign pagan land far from Jerusalem in the diaspora. In fact, Esther could be a guide to how to survive in cities and in culture and in places that we really don't belong. Yet we find ourselves literally far away from where we're supposed to be as a Jewish people, like the city of Seattle. For me, quite literally, as far from Jerusalem as one could be in the world. Adele Berlin and in the Jewish Publication Society commentary on Esther says this: Esther is the most secular of all the biblical books. Yet Esther, of all the biblical books outside of the Torah, is the only one that addresses the origin of a new festival. In fact, the very reason for the book's existence is to establish Purim as a Jewish holiday for all generations. It's interesting because God doesn't command the celebration of Purim. The celebration of Purim was established by the Jewish people, a new holiday not commanded by God, but a marker of an important event in Jewish history, our survival from the threat of death. Esther chapter 9, verse 28 at the end says, "These days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor their remembrance perish from their descendants." Purim is a funny word because Purim is actually, the word pur is Akkadian, and it's a reference to throwing dice from ancient Mesopotamia. They would throw small stone dice and make decisions based on how the die falls. The Greeks write about Persians casting lots or throwing die, and so the name comes from Haman, the bad guy in the story. Haman. The bad guy in the story. He throws dice to remember what day to massacre, to determine. He throws the dice to determine what day to massacre the Jewish people all through Persia. By the end of the story, we find that the day is reversed, but the name sticks. That Purim, casting lots, would be remembered by Jewish people forever as a day when our enemies tried to kill us, and not only did we survive, but we were able to protect ourselves. It's a reversal of how you think the story is supposed to go. And there's many reversals like that in the story. The book of Esther begins with this 100-day banquet with drunkenness and orgies and everything that God commands the Jewish people not to do. Esther chapter 1 verse 1 says, this is what happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. And at that time, King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in the castle in Shushan. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his princes and servants. The military leaders of Persia and Media, plus the nobles and the officials of the province were present, and he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty for many days, 180 days. So Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus of Persia, throws lots of parties. And actually, one of those parties lasts for 180 days. And then at the end of 180 days, he's like, let's do another 7. Drunkenness and orgy and harems and food and extravagance and excess. He dismisses his queen Vashti because she would appear before all the fellas. She would not appear before all the fellas naked. And the search for a new queen, he basically holds an American Idol. I guess it's like Persian Idol, but everybody's naked. So, we talk about how to see God anyway. Do you know that the Hebrew word for banquet we find it 20 times in the book of Esther? And in the rest of the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, the word is only used 24 other times. But the author of Esther uses banquets to tell the story of Esther. And there are many reversals in the story, and most of them happen at banquets. Like Vashti is queen, but she's treated like and becomes a concubine. Esther is a concubine and is treated like and becomes the queen. The book starts with 2 banquets of the king and ends with the Jewish people alive with 2 feast days or banquets. Mordecai saves the king's life, and Haman attempts to take the lives of the Jewish people. But Esther and Mordecai save the Jewish people at a banquet. Haman's promoted, and there's this edict to kill the Jewish people at a banquet. And Mordecai is actually promoted, and then there's an edict that the Jewish people can protect themselves, which happens at a banquet. Haman plots the death of the Jewish people, but Haman and his sons are put to death instead. Esther hosts 2 banquets where Haman is humiliated and Mordecai is lifted up. You know, this is true in the history of the Jewish people, and I found this to be true in my life, and I believe it's true probably in your life as well, even if you can't understand it, even if we don't understand how it works. But it's our task to see God anyway. But how can we see God anyway this year and this Purim, in the midst of chaos and pain and sorrow and grief for so many people in the world, but even for some of you watching specific difficult things? Here's what Karen Job says. She says, the great paradox of Esther is that God is omnipotently present even where God is most conspicuously absent. Tim Mackey says it like this. He says, Esther forces you to see God's purpose at work behind the scenes. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity because there are signs of it everywhere. God is behind the scenes, working in the midst of the pain and the suffering to work all things out for his purpose. So, if you want to see God anyway, if you want to be a person that sees God anyway, even in the difficulties, here's the first thing. You could write this down. The first thing you have to believe is that God sees you even when you can't see him. See, when God seems absent, you look for activity because there are signs of it everywhere in our lives. And we celebrate even while people all over the world attack the Jewish people for being Jewish and living in a land that God gave to us thousands of years ago. Even though God is never mentioned in the literary design of the book of Esther, we are to see God anyway. It's a responsibility for us to see God anyway, even when you are far away from where you're supposed to be, just like Esther and Mordecai. God sees you even when you can't see him. And the second idea follows, which is in the here and now, even though God sees you, even when you can't see him, in the here and now, God also uses pain to lead you to joy. Because there's this tension between joy and grief, between celebration and mourning. They come together in this life, and we look forward to the day when we'll be with God and the tension will end and we'll just have joy and peace. And every time we celebrate, and every time we find joy in the midst of pain and mourning, we catch a glimpse of what eternity will be like for God, with God. Don't rob yourself of joy because of your pain. Instead, let God use pain to lead you to joy. This is what Mordecai and Esther do in the story of Esther. They are Jewish people who end up in positions of power in a foreign land, in Persia. Just like the story of Joseph in Egypt in the book of Genesis, or Daniel in Babylon in the book of Daniel. But in some ways, the story is also the opposite of these biblical heroes, because Joseph and Daniel never hide who they are. Esther not only hides her Jewishness, but perhaps like a Holocaust survivor hiding their Judaism after they survive and move somewhere else. It says, Esther 2 in verse 10, it says, Esther had not disclosed her people or her lineage because Mordecai had commanded her not to make them known. But Joseph and Daniel always seemed to do the right thing and keep themselves from paganism and from the worship of other gods, from eating unclean food, from participating in orgies. Mordecai and Esther seem to participate in the paganism. And unlike the rest of our people, they represent a group that didn't return to Israel. Look, these people aren't perfect. None of the people in the scriptures are perfect. But what they are people who are far away from everything they know and everything that God has promised them. And I suspect that many of us would find ourselves in the same boat. So the story tells us that Mordecai was taken from Israel as a captive and ends up in Persia. And that Esther, Hadassah, was born in captivity. It says Esther chapter 2, verse 5, there was a Jewish man in the Shushan palace whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives that had been carried away, with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had taken away. And he had raised Hadassah, that is Esther, her pagan name, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the girl was attractive and had a beautiful figure. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her to him as his own daughter. Karen Jobes in her commentary says this: the book of Esther is the most true-to-life biblical example of God's providence, precisely because God seems absent. She continues and she says, even in the most pagan corner of the world, God is ruling all things to the benefit of his people and to the glory of his name. But even when his own people, like Esther and Mordecai, make decisions that come from ambiguous motives at best, or perhaps even outright disobedience, God is still providentially working through those very things to fulfill his covenant. That brings us to Haman. Boo! Esther chapter 3 and verse 2. It says, all the king's servants and all the king's men, just kidding, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded it. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay him honor. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he would not listen to them. Therefore they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him honor, Haman was filled with rage, but it was repugnant in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him the identity of Mordecai's people. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Well, that escalated quickly. Haman shifts from this one Jewish guy not bowing down to him to wanting to kill all Jewish people in the kingdom of Persia. But the context tells us that what's happening between Haman and Mordecai is actually an old family feud with several layers. Because Haman doesn't belong in Persia either. Haman is also not a Persian. Haman is, it says in chapter 3 and verse 1 of Esther, sometime later, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and setting his chair above all the officials who were with him. So Haman is not Persian. Haman is an Agagite. And the Agagites are actually one of the ancient enemies of Israel called the Amalekites. The Amalekites did not help Israel when we left Egypt all the way back to Moses. And God said to Moses in Deuteronomy 25, verse 19, at the end of that verse, you're to blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Do not forget. So the writer of Esther calls Haman an Agagite. This is so cool. Watch this. Agag is probably the term, like Pharaoh, for the king of the Amalekites. So the writer of Esther blots out the Amalekites, like Deuteronomy says, by not saying Amalek. Instead, they write Agagite. But Agag is the king of the Amalekites, who's also mentioned in the time of King Saul, who's the first king of Israel. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul is commanded by God to kill Agag and the Amalekites, and Saul does not do what he's supposed to do. So the Amalekites are actually perpetual enemies of Israel. And Haman is a descendant of Agag, an Agagite, which is an Amalekite, And, surprise, Mordecai is a descendant of King Saul. It says Esther chapter 2 and verse 5. Again, it says there was a Jewish man in Shushan whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish is Saul's father. So the author of Esther is saying, by naming all of these people, that Mordecai is a Benjamite from the tribe of Benjamin and from the house of King Saul, and specifically Kish, who is King Saul's father, and Haman is from the house of Agag, which is the king of the Amalekites, who we're never supposed to mention and blot out. That's why he's an Agagite. So there's this old animosity that's actually not even between Jew and Gentile. It's between Haman's family and Mordecai's family, and it's the reason that Haman makes his plot to kill all Jewish people, not just Mordecai. So, of course, by the end, we know that the story reverses all of it, and Haman ends up being killed and Mordecai promoted, because that is what the story is doing. The book of Esther takes the stories that are written, especially the difficult stories, and it flips the script, and God changes the story for the good while remaining hidden behind the scenes. But God does the same thing for us today. He takes the difficult things and the painful things and the hard things in our lives, and he uses them for our good. In fact, the New Testament commentary, I think a New Testament summary of the message of Esther, is written by the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, is also a Benjamite in the tribe of Benjamin through King Saul. It says, Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, "Now we know that all things work together for good, for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose." That doesn't mean all things will be good for everyone who believes. But it does mean that God takes all things, including the painful things and the difficult things, and he works those together with all of the good things for the good of his people. And this is true in the story, in the history, and the story of all the Jewish people for thousands of years. I found this to be true in my life, and I believe it's true for your life as well. That even if you can't see how it works or understand how it works, here's what you have to believe: that God sees you even when you can't see him. In the here and now, God wants to use pain to lead you to joy. And in the midst of all the chaos and the pain and the suffering that we experience, God invites you to a party. Even in the midst of pain, even in the midst of a world going crazy around us, you can celebrate that he sees you and will not forget you. We can celebrate that he sees us and will not forget us as a people. It's funny because Shabbat, I did a message a few weeks ago about the Sabbath, and Shabbat is like a weekly party that gives us a glimpse of the party to come. That there's a party in heaven, in the book of Revelation, that is just this gigantic banquet at the end of all things. It says in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 7, "Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him," not Xerxes, Ahasuerus, but God, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. She was given fine linen to wear, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the completely other people, the Kedoshim. Then the angel tells me, "Right, how fortunate are those who have been invited to the wedding banquet of the Lamb." And he also tells me these are the true words of God. How fortunate are those who have been invited. Which, by the way, we're going to celebrate that meal at Passover in just about a month. And I hope you'll be able to celebrate it with us in person in Seattle, or our video version that will be on our app and YouTube. Catherine Wolfe says it this way. She says, "Celebration can be an act of worship and an act of hope, and perhaps, in a way, an act of joyful rebellion against fear." And on this day, in this weekend, in this month of the Jewish calendar, on this Purim, in this synagogue, right now, this weekend, synagogues all over the world, it's time, in the midst of all the pain that you're experiencing, and in the midst of all the suffering, that we celebrate to see God anyway. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It doesn't mean that there are still things. It means that there are still things to celebrate. And those things coexist with the difficult and the painful things. And when you find yourself in moments and you ask yourself, where is God? Why is God absent? Where are you? Where can you be? Why are you not available to me? I want you to hear how God answers. He's in front of you. He's behind you. He's to the right of you and to the left of you. And he's not going anywhere. And because of this, we can celebrate, even in the midst of pain, that there's this huge banquet with all kinds of amazing food, and you're invited, and there's a seat for you, and he takes all things and works them together for your good. All things. You know, in the banquets of the Persian Empire, the king would have food from all the different provinces of his kingdom, and all through the table would be all these different kinds of food from all these different kinds of places that everyone could eat and enjoy to show his reign over all of the kingdom. And God has this amazing table with this amazing food from everywhere to show that he rules over all of creation, heaven and earth. So how, in this Purim, in this particular year, how can we see God anyway? How can we celebrate in the midst of real pain and suffering? Well, I'll tell you again, because I found this to be true for me. I think where we start is you have to believe that God sees you even when you can't see him. And in the here and now, God wants to use pain to lead you to joy. And in the midst of all of the pain and all of the chaos and suffering, God invites you to a party. Now, today at Restoration, in the afternoon in Seattle, and wherever you are, if you can't join us or go to a synagogue for Purim yourself, here's what I hope that you do. I hope you have a feast, and you invite people into your feast so that as you're celebrating in the midst of the pain, we remember that there's a future event, that there's a banquet that you're invited to. And in the midst of the pain and in the midst of the difficulty, in the midst of sadness, there's this invitation to experience joy at the same time, that the joy of who God is and who we are as his people, and that every time we celebrate in the midst of pain, it's a reminder of the day that's coming, a day where there'll be no more sadness and no more pain. And for now, in the midst of all kinds of pain, we take time and moments to celebrate because God promised we would still be here, and we are still here. So when God feels absent, it is our task to see God anyway. I pray this is an amazing Purim for you. Hag Sameach to those who celebrate. I love you guys, and I can't wait to see you next week.